If you're ready to get lost in the subtext of this story and want more content that challenges your emotions, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your subscription helps us continue creating memorable narratives. The air hung heavy and humid over the sprawling Boone plantation, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on everything, much like the grief that had settled upon Margaret Boone's shoulders. It was 1845, and the Deep South was a land of stark contrasts, verdant fields of cotton stretching to the horizon under a merciless sun, grand mansions that whispered of wealth and tradition, and beneath it all, a simmering tension, a silent acknowledgement of the seismic shifts rumbling across the nation. For Margaret, however, the most immediate tremor had been the death of her husband, Arthur. Arthur Boone, a man of stern countenance and unyielding principles, had been the bedrock of their world. His sudden passing, a swift and brutal fever that had claimed him in a matter of days, had left Margaret a widow, ostensibly in charge of a vast estate and two young, impressionable daughters. But the truth was, Arthur had been more than just a husband. He had been the keeper of her decorum, the architect of her rigid facade. Without him, the carefully constructed walls around Margaret's own desires, long repressed and buried beneath layers of societal expectation, began to show hairline cracks. The weight of her widowhood was not just the absence of a partner, but the sudden, terrifying freedom from a constant, scrutinizing gaze. She had always played the part of the dutiful wife, the respectable lady of the house, her own thoughts and feelings meticulously hidden beneath a veneer of southern gentility. Now, with Arthur gone, the silence in the grand mansion was deafening, amplifying the whispers of her own unfulfilled life. The Boone mansion, a stately edifice of white columns and wide verandas, now felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Its heavy velvet curtains, perpetually drawn against the harsh sunlight, cast the interior in a perpetual twilight, a fitting metaphor for Margaret's emotional state. She moved through its opulent rooms like a ghost, her black mourning gowns rustling softly, a constant reminder of her loss and her new, unwelcome freedom. Her face, once framed by soft curls, was now severe, her lips often pressed into a thin, unyielding line. She was a woman carved from granite, or so she wished the world to believe, a fortress against the prying eyes of a society that judged a woman not by her intellect or her spirit, but by her adherence to convention. Every morning, she would don her widow's weeds, a uniform of sorrow that also served as a shield, allowing her to retreat further into herself, away from the sympathetic glances and whispered condolences that felt more like accusations. Her daughters, Clara and Eliza, were reflections of her in their youth, yet untouched by the world's harsher realities. Clara, the elder at 16, possessed a delicate beauty, her eyes the color of a summer sky, often downcast in shyness. She spent her days immersed in books, her imagination a refuge from the stifling routines of plantation life, dreaming of heroes and adventures far removed from the quiet, predictable rhythm of their existence. Eliza, 2 years younger, was more spirited, though equally reserved in company. Her curiosity, however, burned brighter, a small, flickering flame behind her demure exterior, always observing, always questioning, though rarely daring to voice her thoughts aloud. They were both products of their time and station, taught to be ladies, to be modest, to be silent, their lives meticulously planned out, a path laid before them that offered little room for deviation. They knew little of the world beyond the plantation gates, and even less of the complex, often brutal realities that sustained their privileged existence, built upon the silent suffering of others. The household, like all others of its kind, was run by the labor of enslaved people. They moved through the mansion and the fields with a quiet efficiency, their lives interwoven with, yet starkly separate from, those of the Boone family. Among them was a man named Elias. He was a figure of formidable strength, his physique honed by years of arduous labor under the unforgiving sun. His skin, the color of rich earth, glistened with sweat as he toiled, his muscles rippling beneath his worn cotton shirt. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Deep, intelligent, and often holding an enigmatic gaze that seemed to see far more than he let on, a silent observer of the world around him. Elias was a man of few words, his silence a shield, his presence a quiet force. He was known for his reliability, his skill with horses, and his unwavering composure, even in the face of the overseer's whip. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that belied his station, a silent defiance that Margaret, in her own way, recognized and perhaps even envied. Margaret had observed Elias for years, though always from a distance, through the veiled windows of her drawing room or from the shaded veranda. She had noted his quiet dignity, the way he carried himself, the unspoken authority he commanded among the other enslaved workers. But now, in her widowhood, her gaze lingered longer, sharper, imbued with a new, unsettling awareness. She saw not just a slave, but a man whose strength was undeniable, whose presence was captivating, and whose very existence represented a raw, untamed power that both frightened and fascinated her. It was a fascination born of her own long-suppressed desires, a yearning for something authentic and unvarnished in a life defined by artifice and restraint. The societal taboos surrounding such thoughts were immense, yet, in the isolation of her grief, they began to take root. The idea, when it first germinated in the dark recesses of her mind, was scandalous, unthinkable. It was a seed sown in the fertile ground of her grief and her long-suppressed desires, watered by the oppressive loneliness that now permeated her days. Society demanded decorum, piety, and an unwavering adherence to tradition. But what did society know of the gnawing emptiness within her? What did it know of the desires that stirred, unwelcome and insistent, beneath her widow's weeds? The hypocrisy of her world, where outward appearances were paramount, yet hidden transgressions were rampant, began to fuel her audacity. She reasoned that if the world demanded a facade, she was entitled to her own hidden realities. The plantation, with its vastness and its isolation, was a world unto itself, a kingdom where Margaret, now the mistress, held absolute sway. The rules of the outside world, with its judging eyes and wagging tongues, felt distant, almost irrelevant, within the confines of her estate. Here she could be the architect of her own reality, the weaver of her own forbidden tapestries. The humid air, thick with the scent of magnolias and the distant earthy smell of the fields, seemed to press in on her, creating a sense of claustrophobia that only her radical thoughts could alleviate. The chirping of cicadas at dusk, usually a soothing sound, now felt like a relentless chorus, urging her towards an inevitable, dangerous path. One sweltering afternoon, as the cicadas droned their incessant song and the air hung thick with the scent of magnolias and distant sweat, Margaret found herself in the library, a room filled with the scent of old paper and leather. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the window, watching Elias as he led a team of horses across the dusty yard. His movements were fluid, powerful, a testament to a primal strength that resonated deep within her. A shiver, not of cold, but of something far more potent, traced its way down her spine. The sight of his bare, muscular back, glistening with sweat, sparked a recognition of a raw, untamed masculinity that had been absent from her life for too long, and perhaps had never truly been present in the constrained intimacy of her marriage. It was then that the full scope of her plan began to solidify. It wasn't merely about her own desires, she rationalized, though they were a burning ember she could no longer ignore. It was also about her daughters, Clara and Eliza, so sheltered, so naive, were growing into womanhood in a world that was far from the genteel fantasies of their storybooks. The nation itself was teetering on the brink of conflict, of transformation. The old ways were being challenged, and the future was uncertain. How could she prepare them for a world that would demand more than just modesty and obedience? How could she equip them with the knowledge of life's raw, undeniable truths, truths that society insisted on keeping hidden behind a veil of innocence? She convinced herself that she was not corrupting them, but inoculating them against a world that would inevitably strip them of their naivete. Her husband, Arthur, had been a man of the world, but his teachings to their daughters had been strictly confined to the domestic sphere. He had protected them, perhaps too much, from the harsh realities of their own existence. Margaret, in her twisted logic, began to see her plan as a form of education, a brutal but necessary awakening. Elias, with his quiet strength and his position outside the societal norms that bound her, became the unlikely instrument of this perverse pedagogy. He was the embodiment of everything forbidden, everything primal, everything that society deemed dangerous, and therefore, in her warped view, everything essential for true understanding. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating. It was a transgression of every social code, every moral boundary. Yet the more she considered it, the more it seemed like the only path forward, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control in a world that felt increasingly out of her grasp. The silence of the mansion, once a comfort, now seemed to amplify the illicit whispers of her own mind, each thought a daring step into the abyss. She began to observe Elias more closely, her gaze no longer fleeting but deliberate, assessing. She noted the way he interacted with the other enslaved people, the respect he commanded, the quiet authority in his bearing. He was not merely a laborer, he was a leader, a survivor, a man who carried the weight of his existence with an almost regal stoicism. These qualities, she decided, made him not just suitable, but uniquely qualified for the role she envisioned for him. He possessed a raw, untamed spirit that she, in her corseted existence, had always secretly craved. The nights were the hardest. The vast, empty bed beside her, once filled by Arthur's imposing presence, now felt cold and desolate. It was during these hours of darkness, when the world outside was hushed and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant baying of a hound, that Margaret's resolve hardened. The shame that initially pricked at her conscience began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. She would do this, for herself, for her daughters, for the secret desires that pulsed beneath her carefully constructed exterior. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, seemed to witness her silent pact with herself, a pact that would shatter the fragile peace of her household. The next morning, Margaret summoned her most trusted house servant, an elderly woman named Bessie, whose loyalty had been proven over decades. Bessie's face was a roadmap of life's hardships, her eyes wise and knowing, having seen generations of Boone family secrets unfold. Margaret, however, did not reveal the full extent of her intentions. Instead, she spoke of a need for Elias to perform certain tasks within the house, tasks that would bring him into closer proximity to the family. Bessie, accustomed to the unpredictable whims of her mistress, simply nodded, her expression unreadable, but a flicker of concern, almost imperceptible, crossed her aged features. She had seen this kind of dangerous game before, played by other mistresses, and it rarely ended well. As Bessie left, Margaret walked to the large, ornate mirror in her dressing room. She looked at her reflection, at the severe lines of her face, the dark circles beneath her eyes. She saw a woman on the precipice, about to step into an abyss of her own making. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that held no joy, only a chilling sense of purpose. The game had begun. The air outside was still, heavy with unspoken expectations. The sun beat down, relentless on the fields where Elias toiled, unaware of the intricate web that was being woven around him, a web spun from the desires of a grieving widow and the innocence of her shy daughters. The Boone Plantation, a bastion of Southern tradition, was about to become the stage for a drama that would challenge every notion of propriety, power, and liberation. The secret, once confined to Margaret's mind, was now poised to spill out, irrevocably altering the lives of all it touched. The scent of magnolias, usually sweet, now carried an undertone of something darker, something forbidden, a silent warning of the storm to come. The first step was the hardest, a tremor of apprehension that ran through Margaret's carefully composed demeanor. Yet, the image of Elias, his quiet strength, his enigmatic gaze, fueled her resolve. She had convinced herself that this was not merely an act of self-indulgence, but a necessary, albeit brutal, education for her daughters. The world was changing, and innocence, she believed, was a luxury they could ill afford. This self-deception was crucial. It allowed her to rationalize the unthinkable, to cloak her forbidden desires in the guise of maternal duty. She saw herself not as a predator, but as a visionary, preparing her offspring for a harsh reality that others were too timid to acknowledge. Her initial instructions to Bessie had been vague. A request for Elias to assist with tasks typically reserved for house staff, moving heavy furniture, tending to the stable adjacent to the main house, ensuring the carriage was always ready. These were pretexts, of course, designed to bring him closer, to make his presence a familiar, if unsettling, fixture within the mansion's inner sanctum. She even invented minor repairs that only a man of Elias's strength could supposedly handle, ensuring his frequent presence in the main living areas. The other house servants, particularly the women, exchanged knowing glances, their silent communication a testament to the unspoken rules of the household. They understood that when the mistress began to take an interest in a particular enslaved man, the consequences were often complex and fraught with peril for all involved. Elias, accustomed to the arbitrary nature of his existence, accepted the new assignments with his usual stoicism. He moved through the grand halls, his bare feet making no sound on the polished cypress floors, his presence a stark contrast to the delicate furnishings and hushed atmosphere. His senses, honed by years of survival, were acutely aware of the shift in his duties, the subtle change in the mistress's gaze. He understood that he was being watched, assessed, and that his life, already precarious, was about to become even more entangled in the complex web of the White family's desires. Clara and Eliza, initially startled by his increased proximity, would often glance up from their embroidery or books as he passed, their young eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He was a man of the fields, a symbol of the unseen labor that sustained their lives, now brought into their intimate space, a living, breathing contradiction to their sheltered existence. Margaret observed these interactions from the shadows, a silent puppeteer. She noted Clara's quick blush when Elias's gaze, however fleeting, met hers. She saw Eliza's bolder, more prolonged stares, her brow furrowed in thought, as if trying to decipher the mystery of this powerful, silent man. These reactions, she told herself, were precisely what she sought. The awakening of awareness, the stirring of questions that their sheltered lives had never permitted. She meticulously catalogued every averted gaze, every nervous fidget, every lingering look. It was a perverse, scientific experiment, with her daughter's innocence as the subject. The more discomfort she observed, the more convinced she became of the efficacy of her lesson. One evening, after the lamps had been lit and the dinner dishes cleared, Margaret summoned Clara and Eliza to her private sitting room. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine from the garden and the unspoken tension that always preceded their mother's serious pronouncements. The room, usually a sanctuary of feminine pursuits, now felt charged with an almost electric energy. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows, adding to the dramatic atmosphere Margaret was cultivating. "My dears," Margaret began, her voice a low, measured tone, carefully modulated to convey both authority and intimacy, "you are growing into young women. Soon, you will be expected to understand the complexities of the world, not just the pleasantries we discuss at tea." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, allowing the weight of her statement to settle upon them. "Your father, bless his soul, shielded you from many truths. But I believe it is my duty now to prepare you for the realities of life, for the deeper currents that run beneath society's surface." Her gaze was piercing, moving from one daughter to the other, demanding their full attention. Clara fidgeted with the lace on her sleeve, her gaze fixed on the ornate rug, wishing she could disappear into its intricate patterns. Her heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Eliza, however, met her mother's eyes, a flicker of apprehension mixed with her inherent curiosity, a silent challenge in her steady gaze. She sensed a shift, a new, unsettling direction in her mother's often cryptic pronouncements. "Life, my daughters," Margaret continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, drawing them into her confidence, "is not always as genteel as the novels you read. There are forces, primal and powerful, that govern us all. And to truly understand the world, to truly understand yourselves, you must confront these forces, not shy away from them." She then spoke of the nature of power, of control, of the unspoken dynamics that shaped their society. She spoke of the strength required to endure, to survive, to command. Her words were abstract, veiled, yet their underlying meaning was clear enough to send a ripple of unease through the two girls, a chilling premonition of what was to come. The next phase of her plan was more direct. Margaret began to assign Elias tasks that required him to be in the girls' presence for extended periods. He was instructed to help them with their riding lessons, to accompany them on walks through the more secluded parts of the estate, ostensibly for protection. He was to assist them in the library, reaching for books on high shelves, his powerful frame often brushing against their delicate forms. She even had him help with the heavy gardening tools in the rose garden, where the girls often spent their afternoons. These were not mere tasks. They were carefully orchestrated encounters, designed to break down the invisible barriers that separated them. During these encounters, Margaret insisted on a certain formality, a strict adherence to the master-slave dynamic, even as she subtly undermined it with her unspoken intentions. She would often be present, observing, her eyes missing nothing, a silent judge of their reactions. She would offer seemingly innocuous comments like, "Elias, do ensure Miss Clara's saddle is secure. She is so delicate." Or, "Eliza, perhaps Elias can demonstrate the proper way to prune these stubborn branches." Each word, each instruction, was a calculated move in her dangerous game. Clara initially was terrified. Her shyness, already pronounced, became almost debilitating in Elias's presence. Her hands would tremble as she held the reins of her horse, her voice barely a whisper when she had to address him. Yet, as days turned into weeks, a strange transformation began. Elias, despite his imposing stature, was never harsh. His instructions during riding lessons were clear and patient, his voice a low, steady rumble that surprisingly soothed her nerves. His presence on their walks was protective, not threatening. He was a silent sentinel, a figure of strength who paradoxically made them feel safe, even as their mother's intentions made them feel profoundly unsafe. She found herself noticing the subtle scent of earth and sun that clung to him, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he offered a rare, small smile. Eliza, ever the bolder of the two, found herself drawn to Elias's quiet intensity. She would ask him questions, hesitant at first, about the fields, about the horses, about the world beyond the mansion. Elias, though always respectful and brief in his answers, would sometimes offer a small, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of understanding in his eyes that spoke volumes. Eliza began to see him not just as a slave, but as a man with a deep well of knowledge and experience, a man who lived a life utterly different from her own, a life of raw, unvarnished truth that contrasted sharply with the gilded cage of her own existence. She found herself sketching him more frequently, trying to capture the quiet dignity in his posture, the depth in his eyes. Margaret watched these subtle shifts with a chilling satisfaction. The girls were beginning to see, to question, to feel. Their sheltered world was expanding, albeit in a way that was both perverse and dangerous. The perverse lesson was taking hold, slowly eroding the innocence she had so carefully preserved, and replacing it with a complex tapestry of awareness. Elias, for his part, was a man caught in a silent storm. He understood, with a chilling clarity, the unspoken currents that flowed beneath Margaret's commands. He was a pawn in a game he did not wish to play, a tool in a twisted education he could not refuse. His stoicism was his armor, his silence his only form of defiance. He knew the risks, not just to himself, but to the young women who were now, unwillingly, entangled in his fate. Every touch, every glance, every shared moment was fraught with peril, a tightrope walk over an abyss. He felt the weight of their innocence, the burden of their mother's manipulation, and the constant gnawing fear of the consequences should he misstep. He remembered the day Margaret had first summoned him to the study, a room he rarely entered. The air had been heavy with the scent of her perfume and the unspoken weight of her authority. She had spoken in veiled terms of loyalty, of duty, of the need for certain understandings between them. Her eyes, cold and calculating, had held his, conveying a message that transcended words. He was to be her instrument, and there would be no refusal. The implicit threat, the absolute power she wielded, left him with no choice but to comply, to play the part assigned to him, even as it chipped away at his soul. The weight of her expectations, the unspoken demands, pressed down on him. He was a man with his own desires, his own dignity, his own history of pain and endurance. To be reduced to this role, to be used in such a manner, was a profound humiliation, yet he had no choice. The lives of his own family, his community, depended on his compliance. He had learned long ago that survival often meant bending, not breaking, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay in silent endurance. One afternoon, Margaret arranged for Clara and Eliza to spend time in the secluded summer house, a small, elegant structure nestled deep within the plantation's extensive gardens. She instructed Elias to bring them refreshments and to remain nearby, ensuring their safety. The summer house was a place of quiet contemplation, far from the prying eyes of the main house, surrounded by fragrant jasmine and climbing roses. The air was still, broken only by the buzzing of bees and the distant calls of birds. As Elias approached, carrying a tray with lemonade and small cakes, he could hear the soft murmur of the girls' voices. Clara was reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice melodic and shy, her words drifting through the open windows. Eliza was sketching in a small notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration, her pencil moving with a focused intensity. When he entered, their conversation ceased. Clara's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, and she quickly averted her gaze, her heart leaping into her throat. Eliza, however, looked up, her eyes lingering on his face for a moment longer than was proper, a silent question in their depths. He placed the tray on a small table, his movements deliberate, his eyes carefully neutral, betraying none of the turmoil within him. "Thank you, Elias," Eliza said softly, her voice barely a whisper, a hint of something new in her tone. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement, and then retreated to a respectful distance, positioning himself near the entrance, his back to them, but his senses acutely aware of their presence, of the subtle shifts in their breathing, the rustle of their dresses. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Clara, unable to resume her reading, simply stared at the open book, the words blurring before her eyes. Eliza, however, continued to sketch, though her hand seemed to move with a newfound intensity. She was drawing Elias, his powerful profile, the quiet strength in his posture, the way the sunlight caught the curve of his shoulder. It was a forbidden act, a transgression of the invisible boundaries that separated them, a silent rebellion against the constraints of her world. Margaret, observing from a hidden vantage point among the camellia bushes, felt a surge of triumph. The seeds she had sown were beginning to sprout. The girls were no longer merely innocent. They were becoming aware, their senses heightened, their perceptions challenged. The perverse lesson in obedience and power was taking root, transforming them in ways she could only begin to imagine, pulling them deeper into the dangerous currents of her own making. The humid air of the deep south, once a symbol of languid days, now felt charged with an electric tension. The cicada's song seemed to grow louder, more insistent, a soundtrack to the unfolding drama. The Boone mansion, once a bastion of rigid tradition, was slowly, irrevocably, becoming a crucible for forbidden desires and dangerous awakenings. The stage was set, and the players, both willing and unwilling, were now fully engaged in Margaret's dangerous game. The scent of jasmine, usually sweet and comforting, now carried an unsettling undertone, a premonition of the secrets about to be unveiled. The weeks that followed blurred into a disquieting rhythm, each day a slow, deliberate turn of the screw in Margaret's intricate design. The initial apprehension that had gripped Clara and Eliza began to morph into something more complex, a cocktail of fear, fascination, and a burgeoning, unsettling awareness. Elias, the silent instrument of their mother's will, became an inescapable presence, his proximity a constant, visceral reminder of the forbidden lessons being imparted. The mansion, once a sanctuary of predictable routines, now hummed with an undercurrent of unspoken desires and veiled intentions, a palpable tension that permeated every room. Margaret, meanwhile, refined her methods with a chilling precision. She would orchestrate scenarios that subtly pushed the boundaries, always under the guise of propriety, ensuring that Elias was always within sight, always within reach. She insisted Elias be the one to help Clara with her riding habit, his large, calloused hands brushing against her delicate waist as he adjusted the stays, a touch that was both accidental and deliberate. She would send Eliza to the stables alone, knowing Elias would be there, his powerful form illuminated by the shafts of sunlight filtering through the barn doors, the scent of hay and horseflesh clinging to him, a primal aroma that spoke of a world beyond their refined drawing rooms. These were not random occurrences. They were carefully calculated exposures designed to chip away at their daughter's sheltered innocence. Clara, the more timid of the two, found herself caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Her shyness warred with a nascent curiosity, her ingrained sense of propriety clashing with the raw, undeniable presence of Elias. There were moments, fleeting and terrifying, when her gaze would meet his, and in those brief seconds she felt a jolt, an electric current that bypassed all reason and decorum. She would blush furiously, her heart hammering against her ribs, and quickly avert her eyes, ashamed of the feelings that stirred within her. Yet she found herself anticipating his presence, a secret tremor of excitement mingling with her dread. She began to notice the subtle nuances of his movements, the quiet strength in his hands, the way his eyes held a depth she couldn't fathom, a silent language that spoke volumes. Her innocent world was crumbling, replaced by a landscape of unsettling sensations and forbidden thoughts, a world where the lines between right and wrong, master and servant, began to blur. Eliza, on the other hand, embraced the unfolding drama with a bolder, albeit still hesitant, spirit. Her curiosity, once a gentle flame, now burned brighter, fueled by her mother's cryptic pronouncements and Elias's enigmatic presence. She began to seek him out, not overtly, but through carefully constructed pretexts. She would lose a book in the library, knowing he would be the one to help her find it, his tall frame reaching effortlessly for volumes on the highest shelves. She would linger in the gardens, sketching, until he passed by on his duties, her pencil capturing the lines of his powerful physique, the stoic expression on his face. She found herself drawn to his quiet power, to the unspoken resilience that emanated from him. She saw in him a world beyond the confines of her privileged existence, a world of raw survival and unvarnished truth, a stark contrast to the superficiality of her own life. She felt a growing sense of injustice, a burgeoning empathy for his plight, which further fueled her defiance against her mother's manipulations. One afternoon, Margaret sent Eliza to the stables to retrieve a specific riding crop. The air in the stable was thick with the earthy scent of horses and straw, a stark contrast to the perfumed air of the mansion. Elias was there, grooming a magnificent bay mare, his muscles flexing under his sweat-dampened shirt, the rhythmic sound of the brush against the horse's coat filling the quiet space. Eliza watched him for a moment, mesmerized by the rhythmic sweep of the brush, the quiet communication between man and beast, a connection that seemed almost spiritual. "Elias?" she said, her voice a little breathy, a slight tremor betraying her nervousness. He turned, his eyes dark and deep meeting hers. There was no surprise in them, only a quiet acknowledgement, a silent question. "My mother sent me for the riding crop," she explained, holding out her hand, her fingers slightly trembling. He retrieved it from a hook, his fingers strong and calloused, brushing hers as he handed it over. The touch was fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through Eliza, a warmth that spread through her veins, a sensation that was both startling and strangely comforting. She quickly withdrew her hand, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," she whispered, and then, emboldened by an impulse she couldn't name, a sudden desire to connect, she added, You seem to understand the horses so well." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Elias's lips, a rare softening of his usually stoic expression, a glimpse into the man beneath the mask of servitude. "They speak a language of their own, Miss Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble, deeper than she had ever heard it, resonating with an unexpected wisdom. "One must only listen." Eliza lingered, her gaze fixed on him, captivated by his words. "And what do they say?" she pressed, genuinely curious. Elias paused, his eyes distant, as if listening to the unspoken words of the stable, to the echoes of freedom and constraint. "They speak of freedom, Miss Eliza, and of the burden of the bit and bridle." His words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply within Eliza. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of understanding, a recognition of the unspoken parallels between the horses and the enslaved people, and perhaps even herself, bound by the invisible reins of society. She left the stable that day, not just with a riding crop, but with a new, unsettling insight, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of her world, a growing awareness of the injustices that underpinned her privileged life. Margaret, observing from a distance, saw the change in her daughters. Clara, though still shy, no longer recoiled from Elias's presence. Instead, she would steal glances at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and a nascent longing she couldn't articulate. A silent battle playing out within her. Eliza, bolder and more inquisitive, was clearly drawn to him. Her questions and observations becoming more frequent, more probing, her empathy growing with each interaction. The perverse lesson was indeed escalating into a dangerous game of passion and culpability, a game that was now consuming all its players. The atmosphere in the mansion grew heavy with unspoken desires and hidden tensions. The other house servants, particularly Bessie, watched with knowing eyes. Bessie, with her decades of experience, understood the unspoken language of the plantation, the subtle shifts in power, the dangerous games played behind closed doors. Her loyalty to Margaret was unwavering, but her heart ached for the young girls and for Elias caught in the mistress's web. She moved through the house with a heavier step, her silence now tinged with a deep sadness, a premonition of inevitable sorrow. She had seen this story play out before, in different forms, with different faces, but always with the same tragic ending. The external pressures of the era also began to press in. Whispers of abolition, of conflict between North and South grew louder. The very foundations of their society felt unstable, adding another layer of anxiety to Margaret's already volatile state. She clung to her plan with a desperate fervour, believing it was a way to assert control, to prepare her daughters for a world that might soon be unrecognizable, a world where their privilege might be stripped away. The distant rumblings of war seemed to echo the internal turmoil of her own household, a microcosm of a nation on the brink. One evening, a violent thunderstorm broke over the plantation. The sky turned an ominous bruised purple, and the wind howled through the ancient oaks, rattling the windows of the mansion. Rain lashed against the panes, and the distant rumble of thunder grew closer, more menacing, shaking the very foundations of the house. Margaret, feigning a sudden illness, retired to her room, leaving Clara and Eliza alone in the drawing room, a deliberate act designed to isolate them further. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder, followed by a blinding flash of lightning, plunged the mansion into darkness. The oil lamps flickered and died, leaving the girls in a terrifying, inky blackness. Clara gasped, a small cry escaping her lips, and instinctively reached for her sister's hand, her fingers clutching Eliza's tightly. Eliza, though startled, quickly composed herself, her mind racing to understand the situation. "Stay calm, Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, powerful silhouette against the faint light from the storm outside. It was Elias, carrying a lantern, its flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar room seem alien and menacing. He had been in the kitchen, attending to a minor repair, when the storm hit, and had instinctively come to check on the ladies of the house. "Are you all right, Miss Clara, Miss Eliza?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, a reassuring anchor in the chaos, cutting through the roar of the storm. Clara, still trembling, could only nod, her eyes wide with fear, and something else, something she couldn't name, as the light from the lantern illuminated Elias's strong, composed face. His presence in that moment of vulnerability was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Eliza, however, found her voice, though it was still a little shaky. "Yes, Elias, just startled." He moved with quiet efficiency, relighting the lamps, his presence a comforting warmth in the cold, dark room. As he bent to light a lamp near Clara, his arm brushed against her shoulder. She flinched, but then a strange sensation washed over her, not fear, but a sudden, intense awareness of his proximity, of the heat radiating from his body, of the sheer, undeniable masculinity of him. Her breath caught in her throat, a silent gasp of recognition. Eliza watched the interaction, her eyes sharp, missing nothing. She saw the flush on Clara's cheeks, the way her sister's gaze lingered on Elias's hands as he worked. A new understanding dawned upon her, a realization of the deeper, more primal forces her mother had hinted at. It was not just about power and obedience, it was about desire, about the raw, untamed currents that flowed between men and women, regardless of their station, currents that could not be contained by societal rules or moral codes. As Elias finished lighting the lamps and retreated to the periphery of the room, the storm outside raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within the mansion. Margaret, listening from her darkened room, a faint smile playing on her lips, knew that the game was reaching its critical juncture. The innocence of her daughters was being stripped away, layer by painful layer, revealing the complex, often contradictory, desires that lay beneath. The mask of decorum was beginning to slip, not just for her, but for all of them. The path to liberation, twisted and fraught with peril, was now irrevocably set, leading them all into uncharted and dangerous territory. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, but the emotional tempest it had stirred within the Boone mansion lingered, thick and palpable. The incident in the drawing room, the shared vulnerability in the darkness, had irrevocably altered the dynamics between Clara, Eliza, and Elias. Margaret, observing the subtle shifts, felt a chilling satisfaction. The seeds of her perverse education had blossomed into a dangerous, intoxicating bloom, a testament to her manipulative prowess. The air in the mansion, though no longer charged with lightning, still crackled with an unseen energy, a tension that promised an inevitable reckoning. Clara, once consumed by shyness, now carried a new kind of tension. Her glances at Elias were no longer fleeting. They were prolonged, filled with a mixture of fear, longing, and a profound confusion. Her nights were restless, haunted by images of his strong hands, his quiet gaze, the brief, accidental touch that had ignited an unfamiliar fire within her. She found herself yearning for his presence, even as she recoiled from the implications of such a desire, a constant battle between her upbringing and her burgeoning instincts. Her innocence was not merely lost, it was shattered, replaced by a tumultuous landscape of forbidden emotions, a secret garden of desires she dared not acknowledge, even to herself. The weight of her mother's unspoken expectations pressed down on her, making her feel both a pawn and a participant in a game she barely understood. Eliza, the more pragmatic of the sisters, processed her awakening with a different intensity. She saw the raw truth of her mother's intentions, the cruel manipulation, but also the undeniable power of the forces Margaret sought to unleash. Elias was no longer just a slave. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of the primal energies that society so vehemently suppressed. Eliza's sketches became bolder, her lines more confident, often depicting Elias in various forms, capturing his strength, his quiet dignity, his burdened spirit, a silent protest against the injustice of his existence. She began to question everything, the rigid social structures, the hypocrisy of their genteel world, the very nature of freedom and bondage. Her mind, once confined by the narrow strictures of her education, now soared, grappling with concepts of morality, justice, and human dignity that her mother's twisted lessons had inadvertently brought to light. The climax arrived on a particularly oppressive summer afternoon, the air so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every living thing. Margaret had arranged a small, intimate gathering in the garden, ostensibly for the girls to practice their social graces. Only a few close family friends were invited, ensuring a veneer of respectability, a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy. Elias was instructed to serve refreshments, his presence a deliberate, calculated provocation, a living tableau designed to elicit a reaction. As he moved among the guests, his dark skin a stark contrast to the pale linen and lace, the whispers began. Not overt, but subtle. Knowing glances, hushed comments about Margaret's unusual reliance on this particular slave. The air crackled with unspoken judgment, a palpable tension that Margaret, in her perverse satisfaction, seemed to relish. She thrived on the scandal she created, finding a twisted sense of power in defying the very society she pretended to uphold. The scent of honeysuckle, usually sweet, now seemed cloying, almost suffocating in the charged atmosphere. During the gathering, a small, intricate porcelain teacup slipped from Clara's trembling fingers, shattering on the flagstones with a sharp, startling crack that cut through the polite chatter. All eyes turned to her, her face instantly flushing crimson with shame, her breath catching in her throat. Before anyone else could react, Elias was there, kneeling swiftly, his strong hands gathering the shards, his movements precise and careful, a silent protector in the midst of her humiliation. As he reached for a particularly sharp piece, his hand brushed against Clara's bare ankle. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, yet in that moment something shifted. Clara's eyes, wide and vulnerable, met his. In their depths, Elias saw not just fear, but a raw, undeniable plea, a desperate yearning for something she couldn't name, a silent recognition of a shared humanity that transcended their stations. And in his own eyes, for a fraction of a second, the mask of stoicism faltered, revealing a flicker of something akin to understanding, perhaps even a shared burden. A silent acknowledgement of the impossible situation they both found themselves in. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that illicit moment of connection. Margaret, watching from across the garden, saw the exchange. She saw the spark, the undeniable connection that had ignited between them, however brief, however forbidden. A triumphant yet chilling smile touched her lips. Her plan, in its twisted glory, had reached its zenith. She had succeeded in breaking through the girl's innocence, in exposing them to the raw, untamed forces she believed were essential for their survival. But the moment was not hers alone. Eliza, standing nearby, had also witnessed the silent communion. She saw the vulnerability in Clara's eyes, the fleeting emotion in Elias's. And in that instant, a profound realization washed over her. Her mother's game was not just about education or control, it was about destruction. It was about breaking spirits, about wielding power in the most cruel and intimate ways. The mask of decorum, which her mother had so carefully maintained, had finally fallen, revealing the monstrous depths beneath, a chilling abyss of self-serving manipulation. Eliza felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, a certainty that this path would lead only to ruin. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the mansion was once again cloaked in its oppressive silence, Eliza confronted her mother. She found Margaret in her study, sipping a glass of sherry, a look of unsettling contentment on her face, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows that seemed to distort her features. "Mother!" Eliza began, her voice trembling with a newfound resolve, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "What you are doing, it is wrong!" Margaret slowly turned, her eyes cold and unwavering, her composure almost impenetrable. "Wrong, Eliza? I am preparing you for the world. I am showing you the truths your father kept hidden. You are no longer naive children. You are women, and you must understand the power you hold and the power that holds you." Her tone was laced with a condescending superiority, as if Eliza were a child incapable of understanding. "This is not power, Mother," Eliza retorted, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a righteous anger. "This is cruelty. You are using Elias and you are hurting Clara. You are destroying us, twisting us into something we are not meant to be." The words, once unspoken, now poured out, a torrent of long-suppressed frustration and moral outrage. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her eyes flashed with anger, her grip tightening on the sherry glass. "You speak of destruction, child. You know nothing of what it takes to survive in this world, to maintain what we have. Your innocence was a weakness. I'm making you strong, forging you in the fires of reality." Her voice rose, betraying the carefully constructed facade of calm. "No," Eliza said, shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes, but her gaze remained firm. "You are making us complicit. You are teaching us to be as cold and manipulative as you have become. You are sacrificing our souls for your own twisted desires." The accusation hung heavy in the air, a truth that Margaret could not deny, even to herself. The confrontation was sharp, brutal, a clash of wills that had been brewing beneath the surface for weeks. Margaret, for the first time, saw a defiance in Eliza that she had not anticipated, a strength born not of manipulation but of moral conviction, a spirit she had inadvertently ignited. She saw a reflection of herself, perhaps, but one that had chosen a different path, a path of empathy and justice. The consequences of Margaret's actions began to ripple through the household. Clara, unable to reconcile her burgeoning desires with her ingrained morality, retreated further into herself, her spirit wounded, her joy extinguished. She moved through the mansion like a shadow, her eyes hollow, a victim of her mother's twisted experiment, her once bright spirit dimmed by the weight of forbidden knowledge. Elias, though outwardly unchanged, carried an even heavier burden. He had seen the pain in Clara's eyes, the nascent rebellion in Eliza's. He knew the danger he represented, the impossible position he was in. His forced compliance had created a chasm of guilt within him, a silent scream against the injustice of his fate. Yet he endured, his stoicism a testament to his unbreakable spirit, even as his soul was scarred, his dignity constantly under assault. He knew that his survival, and perhaps the survival of others, depended on his continued silence, his continued endurance. Eliza, however, refused to be broken. The confrontation with her mother, though painful, had forged a new resolve within her. She began to secretly spend more time with Bessie, listening to the old woman's quiet wisdom, learning about the unspoken histories of the plantation, the resilience of its enslaved community. She started to see the world not through her mother's distorted lens, but through the eyes of those who suffered, those who endured, those who, despite everything, still clung to hope. She found a new purpose, a quiet determination to seek justice and to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Boone mansion, once a symbol of unyielding tradition, now stood as a monument to its own decay. The heavy curtains that had once concealed Margaret's secrets now seemed to trap the suffocating air of guilt and despair. The grand facade of decorum had been unveiled, revealing the raw, ugly truth of human desires, power, and the devastating cost of their pursuit. The scent of magnolias, once a symbol of southern charm, now carried a bitter undertone, a reminder of the rot beneath the surface. Margaret, left alone in her study after Eliza's outburst, stared into the dying embers of the fireplace. She had sought to control, to educate, to liberate her daughters from a perceived weakness, but in doing so she had unleashed forces she could not contain, and had, perhaps, imprisoned herself more deeply than ever before in a cage of her own making. The silence of the mansion, once her ally, now echoed with the hollow victory of her own making, a victory that felt more like a profound loss. The deep South of 1845, teetering on the brink of transformation, mirrored the internal turmoil of the Boone family. The old ways were crumbling, and the masks of respectability were falling away, revealing the complex, often brutal, truths that lay beneath. The story of Margaret Boone, her secret selection, and her shy daughters was a stark reminder that even within the most respectable households, Sin could indeed wear the most refined of masks, and that true liberation often came at a price far greater than anyone could imagine. The sun, setting over the cotton fields, cast long, mournful shadows across the land, as if weeping for the souls entangled in its unforgiving embrace. A silent witness to the enduring human drama of power, desire, and the relentless search for freedom. If you felt completely immersed in this narrative and want to continue exploring stories that touch the soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Your participation is what motivates us to create increasingly engaging content. Leave your comment and share your impressions of this journey.